The administrator looked at my wife like she was a problem to be managed. Eleanor was sitting in a wheelchair, pale, 3 weeks into a treatment that was taking everything out of her, and this man in a good suit looked down at his clipboard and said, loud enough for the whole waiting room to hear, "Mrs. Hale, we're going to need to discuss your payment situation before we can proceed today." Payment situation? In front of 40 people? My wife lowered her eyes like she'd done something wrong. "I want you to understand something. I have never in my life raised my voice in a public place. I didn't raise it that day either. I just stood up, slow, the way you stand up when your knees are 68 years old, and I walked over to that young man, and I asked him one quiet question. I asked him if he knew whose name was on the cornerstone of the building he was standing in. He didn't. Of course he didn't. Nobody did. That was the whole point. But he was about to find out, and so was my daughter, and so was the son-in-law who'd arranged this little humiliation on purpose. By the end of that afternoon, a hospital director would be running down a corridor to find me, and the man in the good suit would understand exactly what he'd done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you who I am, and more than that, let me tell you what I never told anybody I was. My name is Walter Hale. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life I was a builder, not a developer, not an executive who golfed with developers, a builder. I started out pouring foundations when I was 19, in boots that never fully dried out from October to March. I learned the trade from the ground up, and I mean that literally, because the ground is where a building lives or dies. People look at a finished building and they admire the tall part, the glass, the height. Nobody ever admires a foundation, but I'll tell you what 40 years in construction teaches you. Everything you can see is being held up by something you can't. The part that does the most work is the part nobody thinks about. Remember that. It's the whole story. I built my first company with 2 men and a borrowed cement mixer. By the time I was 50, Hale Construction had put up half of what matters in this county. Schools, the county courthouse annex, 3 churches, the overpass on Route 9 that everybody complains about and nobody thanks, and a hospital. I'll come back to the hospital. I did well, better than a boy who left school at 16 has any right to do. But here's the thing about how I did well, and it matters, so stay with me. I never once let anybody know how well. I drove a 12-year-old truck. I wore the same brand of work coat my whole life. When Hale Construction sold, and it sold for a number I'm not going to say out loud even now, I didn't buy a big house or a boat or any of the things men buy to announce themselves. Eleanor and I stayed in the same 3-bedroom place we raised our daughter in. Why? Because I watched what money does to people who know they're around it. I watched it my whole career, on job sites and in boardrooms. Money changes how people look at you. It changes how they treat you, and worse, it changes how they treat each other. I decided a long time ago that I would rather be underestimated than performed for. I'd rather know who my family really was than have them behave for the checkbook. I found out. Oh, I found out. But that came later. My wife is Eleanor, 44 years married this spring. She was a school teacher, 2nd grade, 31 years, and there are grown men in this county who still call her Mrs. Hale and stand up a little straighter when they do. Eleanor is the reason for everything I built. She never asked me for a single thing, so the things I gave quietly, the way she'd have wanted. We have one daughter, Grace. She's 40, and I'm going to be careful and fair about Grace because I love her, and because this story is not as simple as one villain and one victim. Grace is not a bad person. Grace is a soft person who married a hard one, and over 15 years I watched the hard one slowly become the voice she spoke in. His name is Brad, my son-in-law. Brad works at the hospital, administration. He came up fast, the way men come up when they're better at being seen than being useful, and somewhere along the way, Brad decided that his wife's parents were an asset to be managed. Old people with a paid-off house and, he suspected, a little put away. He didn't know the half of it. He didn't know any of it. But he'd started, over the last couple of years, to talk to Eleanor and me about getting our affairs in order, about signing things over to simplify the estate, about how he could take the burden off us. I let him talk. 40 years of reading blueprints teaches you to spot a load that's been drawn wrong. I could see exactly what Brad was building, and I could see it wasn't going to hold. I just wanted to know how far he'd go before it came down. Then Eleanor got sick, and I found out how far. Because the hospital where my wife was diagnosed, the hospital where Brad had his office and his title and his good suit, was not just any hospital to me. I knew it better than he ever would. I didn't know it from the administration floor. I knew it from the ground up, because I built it. Let me tell you the part almost nobody alive knows. 15 years ago, this county set out to build a new cancer wing. The old oncology unit was a converted wing from the 60s, and it was a disgrace, and everybody knew it. So they launched a big campaign, galas, naming rights, the whole business, and about halfway through construction, the money ran out. Costs had run over, a big pledged donor pulled out, and the project just stopped. Concrete poured, steel up, and no money to finish it. It sat there open to the weather for 4 months, a skeleton. People drove past it every day and shook their heads. Hale Construction had the contract to build it, so I knew exactly what it would take to finish, down to the dollar, because I'd priced every dollar of it myself. I went home and I sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor, and I laid it out for her. I said we could finish it, not lend the money, not float it, finish it. My crews, my materials, and I don't take a cent of profit on the rest of the job. I eat the margin. It's a lot of money, Elle, I told her. It's more than we'll ever spend in what's left of our lives. But that building is going to be where this county's mothers and fathers go when they're at their worst. And right now it's a skeleton in the rain, and I have the men and the means to stand it up. And my wife, the second-grade teacher, took my hand and said, "Then do it, Walter. But we don't put our name on it. Someone else can have their name on it. We'll just know." So that's what we did. Hale Construction finished that wing at cost, no profit. And more than that, when the fundraising still came up short at the end, I quietly covered the shortfall on the finishing work myself. And I did it through the company books, so no name ever came up at a board meeting. One condition, in writing, that it stay anonymous. The board voted the naming rights to a family foundation that had given a fraction of what we had, and I shook that family's hand at the ribbon cutting, and I was glad to. Eleanor wore her good coat. We drove home in the 12-year-old truck. We never spoke of it again. I built that wing with my own crews, my concrete, my steel. The foundation under that building is a foundation I watched them pour. And the people who run the place today, the young ones like Brad, they have no idea. To them, it's always just been there, the way the young always think the world was finished before they arrived. They walk on my floors, and they never once wonder who laid them. 15 years later, my Eleanor got sick, and the wing I built for this county's mothers and fathers, the one we stood up out of the rain, became the wing where my own wife went to fight for her life. I didn't tell a soul what that building was to us. Not Grace, certainly not Brad. Eleanor and I just went where the treatment was, and if I stood in that lobby a little longer some mornings than a man needs to, looking up at the height of it, well, an old builder is allowed to look at a building. So understand this. On the afternoon my story really begins, not one person in that hospital knew that the frail old man sitting patiently in the waiting room, being talked down to by his own son-in-law about a payment situation, had built the walls around them with his own hands, and had done it for nothing, and had asked for nothing. Brad was about to learn what was underneath his hospital. The same way he was about to learn what was underneath the old man he'd decided didn't matter. Let me tell you about that afternoon. It was a Thursday. Eleanor's worst days were always the days after treatment, so we'd learned to do her appointments early, get her home, get her into her own bed before the tiredness came down on her like a curtain. That Thursday she was already low before we left the house. She'd barely slept. She was cold in a way that 3 blankets couldn't fix, which is a thing the treatment does that nobody warns you about. But she wanted to go. Eleanor never missed an appointment in her life. 31 years teaching, she never once called in sick. That's the woman I married. I got her into the wheelchair at the door because walking from the parking lot was too much that day. And I want to tell you, there is a particular kind of quiet that settles on a strong man when he has to push his strong wife through a set of automatic doors in a chair. I pushed her through mine. I said nothing. I just made sure the blanket stayed on her knees. The oncology waiting room that morning was full, maybe 40 people. You get to know a waiting room when you spend enough Thursdays in it. There's a rhythm to the fear in a place like that. Everybody's polite, everybody's quiet, everybody's pretending to read a phone while they wait to hear something that might change their whole life. It is, I promise you, the least appropriate room in the world to raise your voice in. Everyone there is already carrying the heaviest thing they've ever carried. We checked in. We sat. Eleanor closed her eyes and rested her head against my shoulder, and I held her hand under the blanket, and we waited our turn like everybody else. And then Brad came out onto the floor. Now, Brad didn't work in oncology. Brad worked upstairs, in administration, in the part of a hospital that has carpet. He had no reason to be down on the treatment floor at all. So when I saw him come through the double doors in his good suit, with a clipboard and another man in a lanyard beside him, my first thought wasn't anger. It was a builder's thought. It was, that's not a load-bearing wall he's walking toward. He's coming over here on purpose. He'd seen our name on the day's schedule. I understood that later. He'd seen Walter and Eleanor Hale on the oncology list, and instead of picking up a phone, instead of walking over as family and asking how Eleanor was holding up, my son-in-law had decided this was an opportunity. A room full of witnesses, his own turf, a frail old couple who, in front of an audience, would surely just fold. He walked up to us, and he didn't kneel down to Eleanor's level the way you do with someone in a wheelchair. He stood over her. He looked at his clipboard instead of at her face, and he said it in that carrying voice that men use when they want a room to hear how in charge they are. Mrs. Hale, before we proceed today, we're going to need to discuss your payment situation. There are some outstanding items on the account, and I'm afraid we can't keep providing services indefinitely without resolving them. Payment situation. Outstanding items. Can't keep providing services. Every word of it a lie. And here's the thing. I knew it was a lie the second it left his mouth. I paid that account myself, in full, the first of every month, the way I've paid every bill of my life. There wasn't $1 outstanding, and Brad knew there wasn't. That's what told me what this really was. A man doesn't tell a lie that obvious because he expects to be believed. He tells it because being believed was never the point. The point was the room. The point was to make a sick old woman feel small and frightened in front of 40 strangers, so that when he sat us down that evening with papers to sign, we'd already have learned our lesson about who held the power now. It wasn't a claim, it was a rehearsal, and Eleanor was meant to be the one who learned her part. I felt Eleanor's hand tighten in mine, and then I felt her do the thing that put a cold stone in my chest that's still there when I think about it. I felt my Eleanor, who taught this county's children for 31 years, who never owed a soul a thing in her life, lower her head, like a child who'd been called out in class. She whispered, "I'm sorry. We don't want to be any trouble." Sorry. My wife said sorry. 40 people in that room, all of them pretending not to hear, all of them hearing. An old, sick woman apologizing for existing to a man in a suit who was lying to her face. And I'll tell you what I felt, because I've promised you the truth all the way through this. What I felt was the thing I used to feel twice maybe in 40 years on job sites, right before something went badly wrong. A great and terrible calm. The noise goes away. Your hands stop shaking. You stop feeling angry, because anger is for men who don't know what they're going to do yet, and I knew. Somewhere between my wife's apology and my next breath, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and every step after it, all the way to the end. I let go of Eleanor's hand gently. I told her quietly, "You've got nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. Nothing. You just rest a minute. Let me take care of this." And I stood up, slow, the way you stand up when your knees are 68 years old and they've spent 40 years on concrete floors. I straightened my old coat, and I walked over to my son-in-law, and I did not raise my voice, because I have never raised my voice in a public room in my life, and I wasn't going to let Brad be the first. I stood close so he could hear me, but not so loud the room had to. I said, "Brad, before you say another word to my wife, can I ask you something?" He gave me that little smile, the patient one, the one you give an old man. "Sure, Walter." I said, "Do you know whose name is on the cornerstone of this building?" He blinked. "What?" "The cornerstone," I said, "out front, by the main entrance. The date stone from when this wing was built. Do you know whose name is carved into it?" And Brad, God help him, still smiling, still certain he was the biggest thing in the room, said, "Walter, I don't think this is really the time for—" "Because I do," I said. "I know exactly whose name is on it. And I think, before this goes any further, you should go and read it, right now. I'll wait here with Eleanor. Go on." Something in how I said it moved him. Not what I said, he didn't understand what I said yet. It was how quietly I said it. Men like Brad understand volume. They've spent their whole lives being loud and winning. The one thing they don't know how to read is a quiet man who isn't afraid of them. It confuses them. It should. It's the last thing they ever see coming. He didn't go read the stone. Not yet. He gave a little laugh to the man beside him and tried to get back on script. But I saw it. I saw the first hairline crack run through all that certainty. Because for the first time, the old man he'd decided didn't matter was looking at him like he knew something. And Brad had just enough sense somewhere underneath the suit to feel the floor move. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing on my floor. I need to take you back a few weeks because the waiting room didn't come out of nowhere. Nothing ever does. A wall doesn't fall because of the last push. It falls because of everything that was wrong with it before, that nobody looked at. When Eleanor was first diagnosed, Brad was, I'll admit it, helpful. Suspiciously helpful, but helpful. He knew the hospital. He knew which specialists to call, which forms to file, how to skip the lines that other families wait in. And when your wife has just been told the word cancer, and you're 68 years old and terrified in a way you've never been terrified, a competent son-in-law who says, "Let me handle the paperwork, Walter, you focus on Eleanor," is a hard thing to say no to. So I said yes. That was my mistake, and I'll own it the way I've owned every mistake in this story. I was frightened for my wife, and I let a man I didn't trust get close to the paperwork, because the paperwork was the last thing I wanted to think about. Grief makes you careless about exactly the things you should be careful about. Brad knew that. Brad was counting on that. It was Grace who tipped me off, though she didn't mean to, and she still doesn't know she did. We were in the hospital cafeteria, Grace and I, while Eleanor was having a scan. And Grace was tired and worried about her mother, and she said something that she meant as a comfort. She said, "Dad, I'm just glad Brad's handling all the legal side. He said with everything going on, it makes sense for him to have authority to make decisions in case you're ever, overwhelmed. He said he's setting it all up so you don't have to worry." I kept my face very still. 40 years of poker with subcontractors is good for something. I said, "That's thoughtful of him. What's he setting up exactly?" And Grace didn't know. That's the part that told me everything. My own daughter didn't know what her husband was setting up in her mother's name. She just knew Brad was handling it, and Brad handling it was, to Grace, the same as it being handled. That's what 15 years had done. She'd stopped being able to tell the difference between her husband taking care of things and her husband taking control of things. So the next morning, I did what I should have done weeks earlier. I went and I read the paperwork myself. I didn't ask Brad. I called the hospital's records office directly, as Eleanor's husband and next of kin, which is a thing a spouse has every right to do, and I requested copies of everything on file regarding decision-making authority for Eleanor Hale. It took them 2 days. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor once told me to build that wing and keep our name off it, and I read. And here is what my son-in-law was building. There was a durable power of attorney, for health care and for finances both, drawn up in Eleanor's name, dated 3 weeks after her diagnosis, when she was frightened and exhausted, and signing whatever the competent young man in the family put in front of her. It named Brad, not me, her husband of 44 years, and the document made no mention of me at all. It gave Bradley Vance the authority to make medical decisions for my wife and to manage her financial affairs if she were deemed unable to make them herself. And there was a second document, only started, not filed yet, but I could see the shape of it. A physician's assessment form, the kind you use to establish that someone lacks capacity. It was blank, but it was sitting in the file, waiting, and attached to it was a note in Brad's own hand that I've kept, that I will keep until the day I die. It said, "Also assess spouse, W. Hale, 68, may not be competent to manage E's care or estate, given age and stress. Recommend eval." Recommend eval. He wasn't just coming for Eleanor's money. He was building a case that I was too old and too broken to look after my own wife. He was going to have me declared incompetent. He was going to stand between me and Eleanor at the worst moment of both our lives, and call it care. I sat at that table for a long time. I want to be honest about what that was like, because some of you have sat at a table like it. It is a particular loneliness to hold in your hands the proof that someone has been planning to erase you, and to realize the plan was working, and that your own daughter had been repeating the man's words back to you as comfort. I felt old that morning, genuinely old for the first time. Not tired old, erased old. He'd almost done it. 3 more weeks, 1 signed form from 1 agreeable doctor, and Brad would have had legal authority over my wife's body and my wife's care, and I'd have been a confused old man in the corner that everyone was very sorry for. But here's what Brad didn't understand about foundations, and it's the same thing all the Brads of the world never understand. You cannot build anything on a lie about what's underneath. You can put up something that looks finished. You can make it tall, you can make it shine, you can fool everybody who only ever looks at the surface. But the day a real load comes onto it, the day the weight actually arrives, it finds out what you built it on. And it comes down exactly as far as the lie went deep. Brad had built his whole plan on one assumption, that the old man didn't matter, that I was what I appeared to be, a frail nobody in an old coat pushing a wheelchair. He'd never once checked what was underneath. He never wondered whose name was on the cornerstone. He never asked why the frail old man sometimes stood too long in the lobby looking up. He'd built a very tall plan on a foundation that was about to find out what it was standing on. I made 2 phone calls that morning. The first was to a lawyer, not a local one, a serious one, 2 counties over, a man who'd done work for Hale Construction for 30 years and knew exactly how much was really under my name. I told him what Brad had drawn up. There was a silence on the line, and then he said, "Walter, this is elder abuse. This is a crime. Do you understand that what he's attempting is a crime?" I said I was starting to. The second call I made was to the hospital, but not to Brad, not to records. I called a number I hadn't dialed in 15 years, a private line, belonging to the one person in that entire building who knew exactly who had built the wing my wife was dying in. I called the hospital director, and when she heard my name, my real name, the whole name, there was a pause. And then she said, "Mr. Hale, my goodness, is everything all right? Is Eleanor all right?" I said, "No, something's wrong in your hospital, and it's wearing a suit, and I'm going to need your help to fix it. But we're going to do it quietly, and we're going to do it right." That was the Tuesday. The waiting room, the one I told you about at the start, the payment situation in front of 40 people, that was the Thursday, 2 days later. Which means that when Brad stood over my wife and told her to be ashamed in a room full of strangers, he had no idea that I already had the paperwork. He had no idea I'd already spoken to a lawyer who used the word crime. And he had no idea that the director of his own hospital already knew my name and was already, quietly, on my side. He thought the waiting room was his ambush. He didn't know he was 2 days late. Let me take you back into that waiting room. Because I left Brad standing there, wasn't I, with that little crack running through his certainty, telling me it wasn't the time. I didn't argue with him. That's the thing I most want you to hear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I didn't give that room the drama it was bracing for. I just looked at my son-in-law and I said, "All right, Brad, you don't have to read the stone. Someone's coming who can tell you what it says." Because I'd made one more call that morning before we ever left the house, and right on time the double doors at the end of the floor opened, and the director of the hospital walked in. Her name is Dr. Patricia Osei. She has run that hospital for 11 years, and she is not a woman who comes down to the oncology floor on a Thursday morning. When she appeared, you could feel the room change. The staff straightened up. Even Brad straightened up on instinct, the way he did for anyone above him before his brain caught up and started asking why she was there. She walked straight past all of them. She walked to my wife. And Dr. Osei, who runs the whole building, knelt down beside Eleanor's wheelchair, to her level, the way Brad never did. And she took Eleanor's hand and she said, "Mrs. Hale, I am so sorry it's taken me this long to come and find you. It's an honor to have you here. It should have been an honor from the first day, and I'm going to make sure it is from now on." Eleanor didn't understand. She looked up at me, confused. I just squeezed her shoulder. "Watch, sweetheart. Just watch." Then Dr. Osei stood up and she turned to Brad, and her voice was perfectly pleasant, which was somehow worse than if she'd shouted. "Bradley, a word about the cornerstone, since Mr. Hale raised it." She smiled. 15 years ago, I was the deputy administrator on the capital project for this wing. I sat in the room when it collapsed. When the money ran out, and it stood half-built in the rain, and every donor we had walked away, one contractor finished it, at cost, poured the last of it, roofed it, wired it, and ate the shortfall himself so that this county would have somewhere to bring its sick. He asked for one thing in return, that we never say his name. There's an agreement in our legal files to that effect, and my signature is on it, right next to his. I have kept that promise for 15 years. She let it sit. "I'm about to break it, Bradley, because I think you need to hear it. You've spent the last 5 minutes humiliating the man who built the floor you are standing on. Walter Hale built this wing. Your wife's father built this wing. I have known that every single day Eleanor has been a patient here, and it has been the quiet honor of my career to make sure she was cared for the way this family deserves. I only wish I'd caught what you were doing sooner." I have never in my life heard a room go so quiet. 40 people. You could hear the machines. And Brad's face. I've spent 40 years watching structures fail, and I know the exact moment when a thing that looks solid realizes it isn't. There's a stillness first. Before anything moves, there's a stillness as the load finds the flaw. That was Brad's face, perfectly still, while everything underneath it gave way. He started to say something. Walter, I had no idea." "No," I said, "you didn't. That was rather the point of you. I could have ended it there. I want you to know that. It would have been enough for most men, that room, that silence, that face. But I've told you from the start, this was never about a scene in a waiting room. A scene is loud, and then it's over, and nothing underneath it changes. I don't build things that fall down the moment you stop looking. I was there to fix the foundation, and you don't fix a foundation with a raised voice. You fix it with paperwork and witnesses and the truth, applied slowly so it holds. So I didn't shout. I said, "Brad, this evening, you and Grace were going to sit Eleanor and me down with some papers to sign, weren't you? Let's you and I have that meeting now instead. Dr. Osei, is your office free?" It was. I'm not going to walk you through every minute of what happened in that office, because some of it was just an old man laying documents on a desk one at a time, the way I once dealt photographs onto another table in another story. But I'll tell you the shape of it. I put down the durable power of attorney he'd had my frightened wife sign. I put down the physician's assessment form, the blank one, waiting in the file. And I put down his note. Also assess spouse. W. Hale, 68, may not be competent. Recommend eval. I set that one in front of him, and I watched him read his own handwriting, and I said, "You were going to have me declared incompetent, so that no one could stop you. That's what was in the file, Brad, while you stood in a waiting room and told my dying wife she was a payment problem." Grace was there by then. Dr. Osei had quietly sent for her. And I watched my daughter read that note, in her husband's handwriting, about her own father. And something in Grace's face that had been asleep for 15 years woke up. She looked at Brad, and she said very quietly, "You were going to do that to my dad?" And Brad didn't have an answer, because there isn't one. And the silence was Grace finally hearing the difference she'd forgotten how to hear, between a man who handles things and a man who takes them. Here's what I did, and it was the calmest, coldest thing I've ever done, and I'd do it again tomorrow. I didn't call the police. Not because he didn't deserve it. My lawyer had already told me that word, crime, and meant it. I didn't call them because the moment you make a thing loud and public and criminal, you hand it to a system, and the system becomes the story for years. And my Eleanor did not have years to spend as a witness in her son-in-law's trial. I had something better than a courtroom. I had leverage, and I had a man who finally understood exactly how much I knew. So I told Brad how it was going to be, and I did not raise my voice. The power of attorney was void that day, in front of the director, with legal to witness it. Proper documents drawn up naming me, her husband, as it should always have been. Brad would resign his position at the hospital by the end of the month, quietly, for family reasons. And Dr. Osei made it clear his career in any hospital she had influence over, which was most of them in this state, was finished regardless. And the note, and the file, and the sworn account of what he'd attempted went into a lawyer's safe 2 counties over. Not to the police, to the safe, where it would stay, untouched, for exactly as long as Brad stayed away from my family, and out of my daughter's finances, and never contested a single thing. The day he forgot any of that, the safe would open, and then he could have the courtroom, and the years, and the record. "That's the deal," I told him. "You built something ugly on the belief that I didn't matter. It's coming down now. The only choice you've got left is whether it comes down quietly, tonight, or loudly, in a courtroom, for the next 5 years. I'd think carefully. It's the first real choice you've made in this whole business." He chose quiet. Men like Brad always choose quiet, in the end, once the quiet man across the table stops being afraid of them. It's the only language they were ever really speaking. Eleanor finished her treatment that autumn. I'm not going to tell you she's cured, because that's not a word the doctors use, and I've promised you the truth the whole way through. I'll tell you what's true. She's here. She's home. This morning she was out in the garden in her good coat, and she called me to the window to look at something, and I went, and it was nothing. It was just a bird, and it was everything. Grace comes on Sundays now, alone mostly. She and Brad are sorting out what a marriage is when one person has finally seen the other one clearly, and that's her business, and I stay out of it, except to tell her the same thing I've told her since she was small, that she was never the soft one. She just married someone who needed her to believe she was. There's a spine in that girl. It's her mother's. It's coming back. And I still stand too long in that hospital lobby sometimes, when we go back for Eleanor's scans, looking up at the height of it. Only now, when I look up, my daughter stands next to me and looks up too. She knows what it is now. She knows what's underneath it. I want to leave you with the thing I know, after 68 years and 40 of them in construction. It's the only thing I really know, but I know it all the way down. The world is full of Brads, men and women who are very good at the tall part, the shine, the suit, the carrying voice, the appearance of being in charge, and they will look at you when you're old or sick or quiet or kind, and they will decide that you're a nobody, because nobody they respect ever looks like that. Let them. Let them decide it. Because everything that's actually holding up this world, everything load-bearing, every real thing, is down where they never bother to look. It's in the quiet ones. It's in the foundations. It's in the people who gave the most and asked for their name to be left off it. They never check what's underneath. That's their weakness. And it will always, always be their weakness. Don't you raise your voice. You don't need to. You just make sure that when the weight finally comes, you're built on something true. And then you wait. The foundation always wins. It was always going to win. It's just patient. I'm Walter Hale. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. If any of this rang true, there's a place for you here, with people who know that the strongest person in the room is usually the quietest. Like and subscribe, and come back next time. The porch light's always on.